you use the name of the territory that you belong to. So Ramavol is my territory, and then Liisa-Rávná is my given name. But of course, due to colonization, I now have a last name. So globally, I am, and also my passport states that I am Liisa-Rávná Finbog. So Björn asked me a while ago to give a talk on my work as a curator. And so I've been thinking back and forth how to present this. And I think that so when we consider art and curatorial practice, we also need to keep in mind that these are very diverse expressions. Um, and they are also very significant, right? But it seems to me that there is a very limited, if growing, scope of literature that explores how art and culture or art and curatorial practice may and do embody dynamic as well as complex assertions of indigeneity. More to the point, I think as we face both pressures of climate change, of wars, and increased pandemics, while at the same time battling the dual demands of our continued struggle for local and indigenous autonomy or sovereignty, and the intricacies of a global economic development in our homelands. The question of how both indigenous art and curatorial practice may engage in and with these topics grow ever more pertinent. Now, for some context, I don't actually consider myself to be a curator, despite multiple positions in which I have had to curate, nor do I especially connect with the idea of art, or more to the point, I don't see myself as particularly connected to the art world. It is impossible to discount how the role of curator, in a historical sense, has been deeply embedded in the imperial function that galleries and museums have served, where indigenous art, artifacts, and objects were collected, interpreted, and displayed without the consent of its indigenous source communities, and also without the knowledge of its indigenous source communities being embedded in that process. The global art scene, similarly, carries the legacy of systematic disempowering and even dispossession, as indigenous art, again historically, has typically been defined as either ethnographic object or primitive art. So rather than identifying as a curator, I find myself to be far more connected to the idea of keeping with the curatorial practice, striving to contribute to my communities and my Sámi nation by centering the ways of my people, which helps inform a practice of collaborative process and dialogue. In this, I have found my entry point in the aesthetic practices of my people, or to be more concise, my work with curatorial practice is founded on my experience as an aesthetic practitioner engaged within the practice of Doji. And just to specify, let's see here. Doji is an aesthetic and a dynamic practice that both form and is formed by collective or through a collective practice that is acted upon and decided collectively between communities and practitioners, which are called doyars. It is a practice of making or of creation that involves the work of hands, which are directed by land based philosophies, ethics, cosmology, and ancestral wisdom. More often than not, however, doji has been translated to mean craft. And while it certainly does involve, as I said, the work of hands, doji far expands the lacking description of craft. So, in my own work and research, I have defined doji as a Sámi epistemology, so a system of knowledge that materializes as a customary practice of creation involving aesthetics, knowledges of materials, place, and season, as well as a Sami holistic worldview that touches upon spirituality, ethics, and the interrelational qualities embedded in the multiple worlds of creation. Um, and so it is from my work within this indigenous aesthetic practice, both as a practitioner but also as a scholar of, that I hold the space needed to reflect on art and curatorial practices, but from an indigenous Sami perspective. And it is this perspective that informs today's reflection. Now, thinking about what could be the topic today, I kept coming back to one specific thought. So, like Byung, I often do a lot of panels and talks about my work within Indigenous art or curatorial practice. But it seems to me that whenever I do these talks, whenever I give interviews on my own practices or the exhibitions that I have curated or been connected with, one question always looms, for better or for worse. Why has indigenous art had such huge success and or impact internationally? Now, I don't claim to have a final answer, and I'm not really sure if there is one, but I do have a theory. Though this is not tested and tried, it is not a tested and tried line of inquiry. Um, it is a theory that is based on my own experience and reflection, and it is condensed into three very specific factors. And these are also the factors that have given the title for this talk. So, this theory, for lack of a better word, is based on the notion of care, of community, and finally of apocalypse, and how these three seems to be connected. So for the next, well, maybe not hour, but 45 minutes at least, I'll try to walk you through all of these three, starting with the latter or apocalypse. So the apocalypse has a very particular presence in popular culture, and honestly, it is one of my favorite genres of both films, television shows, and books. And these are also where we kind of see these stories play out. So, films about the end of days, books and literature on Armageddon, that together create the assumed certainty of knowing that the world lives on, but that it might not do so forever. And this is a thought that I think more and more that we have all come closer to. Um, because aside from the pandemic, aside from the pandemics that we see continuously reappearing, we are also struggling with increased climate change, especially in the Arctic, where we very clearly see a large difference just you know in the last 10 years, the difference in winters in the Arctic is um, impossible to put into words. So I think we all have come closer with this idea of the Armageddon, the apocalypse, being a very real possibility. But actually, amongst ourselves, and by ourselves, I am referring to indigenous communities, the idea of the apocalypse is one that, is not simply informed by fiction. Rather, as peoples, we intimately know and live with the notion of the apocalypse because there is a tendency to think that the indigenous apocalypse, if contemplated seriously, has already happened. So the thought then is that with the onset of colonization, indigenous worlds entered into apocalyptic times. Colonization was our apocalypse. And this, it's very easy to understand why this is the case, because if you think about colonization as a process, we are truly talking about a war that is waged on both bodies and minds as well as on lands. And the goal of this war has always been the destruction of people and minds and the enslavement of the land. But, you know, colonization perhaps failed in erasing indigenous people, but the process of it did have serious repercussions. Epistemicide, which is a word for the colonial killing of knowledge, genocide, forced relocations, and the spatial distancing of people from land, the alienation between people and kin, both human, non human, and spiritual, are just some of these consequences. And yet, in establishing our present, and indeed any age after first contact as an apocalyptic age, we must also make room to contemplate how, even in the midst of ongoing cataclysmic events, indigenous peoples, against all odds, continue to survive and thrive. Because as peoples, we retain our cultural practices and epistemological competencies. So we retain our culture, we retain our knowledges, asserting both spiritual and ontological values and meanings into everyday life. So the joy then of maintaining our ways of being, what we term ontology, or knowing, which is epistemology, and doing, so axiology, can never be subsumed by the bitterness of knowing that at one point our world, as we knew it, ended. So rather than simply perpetuating the bitterness of our colonial experience, reinforcing the image of ourselves as victims or characters in need of saving, we must also focus on the joy of our resistance and our continued survival. Because it is precisely this ability, our survivance, that is at the core of how we as peoples collectively engage in a process of indigenous becoming. And our survivance is nothing more or less than, and I quote, an active sense of presence, the continuance of native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victory. And here I invite you to share in our reflection. Because while it is indeed the case that apocalypse in popular culture has come to be synonymous with catastrophic, often used to denote the end of the world, the etymology of apocalypse, so the meaning of apocalypse, signifies something very different. From the Greek word apocalypsis, meaning to disclose or reveal, Apocalypse as a term is actually not intended to describe catastrophic events. In fact, as it has been conceptualized by scholars of Old Testament critique and interpretation, an apocalypse is, and again I quote, intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in light of the supernatural world and of the future. So, in this sense, how we understand and employ apocalypse as both a word and a concept is layered in assemblages, collections that cross between, together, and even against one another. So, enduring in fluidity, generating this world of multiplicities, of multiple meaning that perhaps is could be better explained as a multiple, like as multiple worlds. Um, so when we speak of the native apocalypse, I think this is a way of talking that reveals that there is an understanding of a double meaning, a double function. So, and the reason I think that is that if you look at most colonial contexts where power relations are uneven, so asymmetrical, these even when these power relations often favor the colonizer on account of the colonizer, the latter often develop extremely sophisticated systems that, while visually may seem to agree with the colonial demands, actually does anything but. So, as a response to the violences that come with the process of colonization, indigenous communities has developed ways to include ideas and values that are hidden or only referred to by this previous knowing, um, never intended to be understood by those in the dominant culture. So these are meanings that were never meant for the colonizer. It has always been for the colonized. And this has actually been one of the ways that we have ensured that cultural practices and beliefs remain in ways that are invisible to the colonial gaze, but scream very loudly to the colonized. So, in a Sami context, we see this in the Getsidemi. Now, there isn't really no translation of this word that would fit exactly because, so I think that implications of the word is perhaps easier to understand. So the word Getsidemi implies context, right? So it is a way of acknowledging that everything is layered. So there are multiple meanings to things. So one layer of meaning is, on the surface level, and everyone understands that meaning. Everyone gets that. It's the deeper meanings, those that are hidden beneath the upper layer. Those are secret meanings only known to those that are sort of included in a specific group, right? So this means that whenever we look at objects, whenever we look at practices or art, it is always contextual. So it is always a site of multiple meanings, stories, and understandings. So the Getsidemi is actually then something that encourage a deliberate plurality of meanings. And so this means that, or this encourage again, the development of a proficiency in multiple language. So you can actually think about it as being multilingual, right? Um, so this means that in a conflict of understanding between the colonial and the colonized, um, this conflict might not be visible to the colonizer, but the colonized see it, understand it, and create ways to sort of go around it, right? And one of the expressions in Duodji where we see this very clearly happening is the Chalichimia. Uh, so the Chalichimia, as seen here, is an iconographic language. So this is a language of symbols. So in these images, what I see is a written language that I can read because I know the language. But you, um, looking at these images, would not be able to read that same thing. You see images of what looks to be decoration, right? Um, so the Chalichimia is usually expressed in beadings and embroideries. This is a language that embeds concepts, ideas, and stories that builds upon very rich teachings of Sami ways of being, again, ontology, knowing, epistemology, and doing, so axiology. Um, but this is a very strictly regulated language, so it's not something that is taught outside of our communities. It is something that even within our communities, only a few gets to learn. Um, and it is also very strictly regulated to women. So primarily, the Chalichimia was and is practiced by women. And interestingly enough, the language actually expanded during colonization. So, especially during the colonial drive to erase both the knowledge and the practice of Sami religion after the 16th century. Now, this was a process that sort of culminated with the massive effort to collect and destroy and remove the Sami drum from Sápmi. So, and just to expand a little bit on the drum is a marker of both spatial perspectives on land as well as the many various layers of reality in Sami worlds of existence. So, on the one hand, the drum is a map. It is a map that describes the landscape that you live in, but it is also a map that describes the world of the living, the world of the gods, the worlds of um, the people living underground. So, in addition to that, or because of that, the drum was a collection of knowledge, an archive with information about the practice of Sami ritual life. So, when the drum was removed from our communities, the colonial governments had hoped to destroy the information within the drums, which would then destroy our religious practices. So this, it is very easy to imagine that this could have been the case, that they had actually achieved to destroy our religious knowledge and practice. But this is where the Giatsidemi, so this context comes into play, because the information in the drums did survive, um, and it survived through women taking that knowledge, transferring it into their language of Chalichimia, so into their embroideries. Um, So if we look at this image, for instance, this is inverse crosses in groupings of three. And this is a symbol that was adapted to the Chalitimia to signify the three sister goddesses that govern all life. So in Sami religion, there are three important female goddesses, Saraka, Uksaka, and Yuksaka. Um, and they're um, and because they were a set of 1853, what happened was that missionaries and colonial governments, when they saw this symbol, they assumed that it represented the Holy Trinity. So the Christian idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Actually, it was meant to represent the Sámi goddesses of human life. So so in order, or in addition to sort of becoming this um, multiple layered understanding, where you again have the upper layer where visionaries thought that they understood the symbol, the Sami people looked beneath the upper layer, seeing that no, actually, this is an expression of Sami religion that continues. So, far from representing then an allegiance to the church and the Christian belief, this was a way of publicly stating that you rejected said institution. So, this adds another layer of meaning because in this way, those that continued to practice Sami religion would know one another, recognizing when it was safe to talk about beliefs and when you needed to keep silent. So, in other words, engaging in the double perspective of the Getsidemi is actually a very important tool of survivance, which accentuating the degree to which the Sami people have maintained knowledge as well as cultural and spiritual values despite having experienced colonization. So the Getsidemi thus ensures that to fully understand a phenomena, a process, an object, or a practice, it is not enough to have verbal information, nor does visual or tactile interaction alone assert the full spectrum of meaning. Indeed, full understanding only comes when you have Getsidemi or context. So I've given you now the word and a specific example from my people and my culture, but indigenous peoples all across the world has had similar forms of doubleness in their culture. And this is precisely the doubleness I see when indigenous people use the term apocalypse. Because while apocalypse does refer to catastrophe in line with popular culture, referencing colonization and the harm that colonization inflicted, it also reminds us that as peoples, we continue to exist and that the apocalypse can also be a revelation where an external pressure forces us to adapt and in the process develop and create new ways of meanings and understandings. Now, I'm not saying this as some sort of defense. I'm not trying to argue the benefits of colonization. On the contrary, I am highlighting the very diverse and ingenious ways that indigenous peoples, despite colonization, has managed. And when I say that indigenous people have managed, I am really speaking to a specific process of indigenous sovereignty that has a very complex history within the Sami community. So, if there is a Sami word for sovereignty, then it is to manage or to birget. Because this so to birget, reflects that in order to have a good life and to be a valued member of the community, you must have balance in all things, in your personal life, with your interpersonal relationships, but also to the land and waters other than human beings and to spirits. So this is a state of being that we call birkijuppi, and it describes the maintenance of a good life. So to think of sovereignty in a Sami context, that means to be able to live a good life. That is sovereignty. So community then, which is the second word of this talk, is actually the foundation of our sovereignty as a people. As similar to most indigenous worldviews, at the core of a Sami understanding of the world, we find a deep connection between the land and its people. This bond of kinship is intimately rooted in and facilitated by our cultural practices, our languages, our knowledge systems, and our spiritual beliefs. Now, there are many concepts within our languages that embody this interaction between people, lands, and entities. Sida, which is how we name community, is one such term. Today, most historians would likely describe the Sida as a social structure dividing territories and ownership of those territories between groups of people. And while this is not entirely incorrect, it is an understanding that is based on a Western worldview where land is property and may thus be owned. But if we reshift or if we recenter the understanding of Sida to a Sami ontological framework, the social structure the Sida is better explained as clan based territories. So within each Sida, the use of resources uh, relied on whether or not you could claim lineage within a clan, not in the sense of ownership, but in order to create a balance and a sustainable use of resources. Now, what I mean by that is that when living in and off the area in the Sida, this facilitated for people to gradually learn to manage said area without exhausting the natural resources. So you would learn to know the land, the lakes, and the rivers, and you would learn to know the presence of other beings, right? Um, in our language, so in Sami language, we actually distinguish between beings. So, on the one hand, you have beings that do not speak. Now, this is in Sami we would refer to as luondu or animals. And then you have beings that do not breathe. Now, beings that do not breathe may be a lake, so javri. It could also be the land or the earth, so ena. But it doesn't really matter whether or not entities speak or breathe or do none of these things. The most important thing is that every being is still morally sensible and capable of subjective will, because the rivers will run, the earth will move, and the wind will blow. So, in this way, Sida is not only a word for community, it is also a very processual term that reflects that the community you live in, the community you live in, is also created, formed, and produced in relationship with all of these beings. So it is actually the encounters between all of these beings. It is the relations between people to land, to beings within the Sida that ensures the good life or birgiupmi. And this is actually, it is from understanding this that the Sami people have learned to care for all their relations, inspiring a very specific philosophy that we term a duty of care. And this brings me to the third and final word of the day, care. Now, as a concept, care remains ambivalent in both significance and ontology, meaning that how we understand the term may be vastly different. So, in a Sami context, care is an essential component in many philosophies, but especially the philosophy of gift giving. And I'll talk a bit about this philosophy to explain the Sami notion on care. Now, as I've already stated, the worlds that we live in and besides are created through an intricate web of connections that extend from many and complex relations between and to people, land, waters, various beings, and other spiritual entities. These relations are essentially what makes up the social structure of the world, and as an extension of that, the Sida. So, this nexus of connections are what define not only the community, but also the place of the individual within said community. And these connections may manifest through the practice of gift giving. Now, a gift can take on many shapes. So, it can be a physical object, you gift something, um, or it could be a song, a dream, or just, the gift doesn't have to be a physical object. It can also be an intent, an intention. But no matter what form it takes, the intent behind the gift is always to make the receiver aware that they are part of this nexus of connections, a world of relations, and that they are, as such, responsible for maintaining these relations in a good way, which connects back to the idea of birgiyukmi, or the good life. In turn, this presumes a responsibility on the part of the recipient to act accordingly and to respect the relations that you are involved in, honoring them in everyday life. Now, this is what we might term a relational accountability. And this is the backbone in what essentially is a system of kinship. So, in this system of kinship, the act of making your relations kin, we can't really say that this is specific only to a Sami context, because it is a basic principle in many indigenous philosophies. In the Lakota and Dakota philosophy of Turtle Island, for instance, and Turtle Island is what is today termed the United States or Canada. We find the Mitakoya Oyasin. Now, this is an expression that means all my kin, or we are all related. Um, in the Wiradjuri philosophy of what is now known as Australia, there we find the Yindi Amarra, which is a way of living where everything is respected. And in Sapmi, or in the Sami context, we have the Golmiedakya. So the Golmiedakya, and I put up the expression, or the symbol for the Golmiedakya as we find in the Chalichimia, the language of embroidery. The Gulmiyadaki holds a very specific meaning. It holds the meaning of reciprocity in all our relations, or all my relations. And this encourages what we might term a duty of care, which calls upon the responsibility of every human being to care for the land, for the animals, for the waters. So to care for your relations. Now, put this in a slightly different way, the Gulmidakia is actually an expression of the fact that we are not alone in the world, and that for every choice that we make, we do not feel the consequence of that choice alone. So, as opposed to the Western world that idealize the individual, in a Sami world, what matters is the collective, because it is the collective that feels the impact of the individual. So, having gone through all of these terms and concepts, if I now connect care, community, and apocalypse to art, curatorial practice, a specific landscape emerge. It is a landscape in which the collective community is the foundation of your sovereignty. where it is the whole of something rather than the single aspects that is afforded due consideration. It is a landscape where the care you offer to others is informed by the recognition that we are already involved in and together with land and waters, with the sky and the horizon, with other humans and spiritual entities, with other animals and living organisms. As such, what happens to them also happens to you. It is a landscape that recognizes the subjective will of all things. Consequently, it creates the understanding that when you inflict your will on others, you are also subjugating their will, which in turn kill the bonds of kinship that create the community we live in and so the worlds that we exist in. To try and translate this into art and curatorial practices, consider this. As a practitioner or an artist, what you create is an expression of the world that you live in, an expression of the system of kinship that you as well as your art takes place in. A good example of this in practice we find in the performance Matriarchy that I, together with two others, curated for the Nordic Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of 2022. As I'm sure that many of you are aware, last year the Nordic Pavilion was transformed into the Sámi Pavilion. Now, in the press release, it reads as follows. In an historic first, the Nordic Pavilion in Venice has transformed into the Sámi Pavilion with a project commissioned by Office for Contemporary Art Norway featuring the Sámi artists Paulina Fjodorov, Mara Annasara, and Anders Sunna during the 59th International Art Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia in 2022. This transformation of the Nordic Pavilion celebrates the art and sovereignty of the indigenous Sami people, whose nation extends across the Nordic countries and into the Kola Peninsula in Russia. Now, Paulina Fyodorov's performance of matriarchy is especially interesting if you want to look at the notions of care and community, as I have already discussed them or described them. As she herself explains it, matriarchy is a collective performance. It is a performance of healing and of renewal. And she conceives of this process of healing and renewal as a process that return us to a world of kinship between people, land, water, spirits, and other than human beings. In a sense, then, Fyodorov understands that the reassertion of a good life or of Birgejupmi is a necessary step towards healing and renewal. And this assertion of the good life of Birgejuppi, she achieves by reenacting the Sami practice of gift giving, which, as discussed, is a central element of Sami philosophy that guides the relations of care between indigenous or between the people, the land, the waters, and every entity within that land. So Paulina's performance thus centers matriarchal values of care and collective models of existence to restore sovereignty um, and sovereign forms of living in Sami society. And I did put in, I hope this works because I put in just a short clip from the performance. So fingers crossed. Mm. I hope you could hear and see that. It might not have been the best quality, but I'm sure that Byung will have an opportunity later on to send you the link to this short clip so you can see it on your own. So, so matriarchy then, as a performance, is very explicitly a demonstration of how an indigenous artist inserts the knowledge and practices and way of living from their community into their art, right? So, having looked at art and how art connects to these terms of caring community, let's now move on to curatorial practice. Because when you curate art, when you work as a curator, um, to be to honor and be respectful towards indigenous practices and ways of understanding the world, especially in a Sami context, you need to be aware. You need to understand that you have to maintain a good balance in your practice, and that this balance honors the place of the artwork within a system of kinship, as well as your own place within that system of kinship. So, by saying that, what I mean to say is that when you work as a curator, and this is true for all Indigenous artwork, and also, I think, for artwork in general, because curatorial choices that is made in the process of a curatorial practice is also choices that is being made on behalf of something or something else, right? So when you make a curatorial choice, when you are responsible for creating an exhibition and you implement a methodology, a framework, and an understanding in that work into the process, you have to recognize that you are also making those choices, not simply for yourself. You are making them on behalf of the artwork, on behalf of the artists, and on behalf of the context that the artist and the work itself is situated within. So, there is another example from the Sami Pavilion in which this is very, um, in which this became very clear. So during um, during the work on the Sami Pavilion, a very important aspect of the curatorial process was to create a space of sovereignty. If you will remember, when I read you the short segment of the press release in connection with the pavilion, sovereignty was one of the things that was highlighted. So I've already discussed the Sami understanding of sovereignty as a good life, a way of managing a good life, and how this way of managing a good life grows from the collective community and from the duty of care. Nevertheless, I do want to stress that as a concept, sovereignty is again ontologically ambiguous because depending on context, it may and often does mean very different thing. For instance, in the West, sovereignty has usually been understood as a political and legal concept. So, tied to the Westphalian state system, sovereignty as a term was initially developed in close alignment with the advance of the modern nation state, denoting the total authority of a ruling body and the person within and persons within defined geographical borders. So, in that sense, the project of sovereignty has typically taken nationhood as its institutional currency. And so the mainstream view on sovereignty is, in other words, mostly shaped around legalistic and state centered. definitions. The conventional understanding of sovereignty is as such very limited because this is an understanding of the concept that is almost impossible to apply on indigenous lands. Firstly, because of how indigenous people themselves understand the concept of sovereignty, and this is very seldom connected to a nation state. Um, and this brings me to my second point, that if we look at the definition of indigenous, what is a typical commonality is that we find a lack of recognition as a nation state to be almost a prerequisite for being defined as indigenous. So if we look to the International Labour Organization, ILO Convention number 169, and this is a convention that pertains to tribal and indigenous peoples. And I also bring it up because this is the definition that has been uh, incorporated in Norwegian law. Then the definition of indigenous is a distinctive culture descended from the populations which inhabited a country or a geographical region to which a country belongs at the time of conquest or colonization or the establishment of present state boundaries. So, being defined as indigenous implies that you are not internationally recognized as a sovereign nation, meaning that by very definition, we are, as the Sami scholar Jorunn Jernsletten articulates it, homeless in our own homelands. But just to clarify, this sense of being homeless in one's own homeland is not a status or a feeling that we ourselves have created. In truth, it is very much a sense that have been enforced on us again and again as a response to our attempts at asserting our status as being home in our own lands or asserting our sovereignty. And this was certainly the case when we transformed the Nordic pavilion into the Sami pavilion. So, a small but very important part of that process was to erase the visible traces of the nation states of Sweden, Finland, and Norway from the pavilion, as these are the very nations that have colonized the Sami homeland. So, our intended strategy was to remove the brass lettering of these nations from the walls, replacing them with Sapmi, which is the Sami old name of our own nation. But we were not allowed to do this. In the response from the Biennale, it was argued that because each pavilion represented a nation, and because Sapmi was not a recognized nation, it could not establish its own pavilion within the Giardini, so the area of the Biennale. So, in essence, then, because the Sami people was and is a colonized people, we were told that we could not represent any other nation than that of our colonizers. Of course, we refused to settle for such, and in our rejoinder to the Biennale, we said that in that case, we would prefer to have no lettering on the walls. So, not Finland, not Norway, not Sweden, and not Sapmi. But again, we were disappointed by the response. So, in the response from the pavilion, it was said that every pavilion represents a nation, and so every pavilion must be named with that nation. So I realized that the struggle that I'm describing here may seem to be of little consequence, because does it matter if the brass lettering on the wall says Finland, Norway, Sweden, or Sapmi for that matter? And my reply to that, and also the reply from the artists, was that yes, it matters, because not having the lettering of Sápmi on the wall, being told that we need to put the names of the colonial nations on the wall, on the one hand, represented us accepting that we are nothing more than a colonized people. Refusing, on the other hand, to put any of these names on the wall would uphold the truth that we are still a Sami nation. And despite the nationalities of our passports, we are the people of Sapmi. So it was a very important discussion. And this is where the job of a curator becomes very important, because it is the curator's job to ensure that the artist does not feel unsafe or forced in any way within an exhibition. So, faced with what seemed to be an impossible solution, we actually took our inspiration from one of the artists, Anders Sunna, who once said that in a Sami context, art is the only voice we have left. And the solution became, as you can see in these images, to disguise the
Lisa,
names. Yeah.
Lisa, can we bother you a little bit because we had the limited time, and can we sweep to another link to using the second link because our time is
Okay. Yeah.
end.
No.
Okay.
I actually. Yeah. I mean, we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, can we use the second link, and we drop
We
out
can.
and we
Yeah. I
return
mean,
again?
I'm almost done. Like, this is the last slide,
Are you
actually.
almost?
So I can
Yeah.
just. Yeah. Um, okay, so just to finish up, this then became the
Yep.
solution, right? We created collectively a panel made out of birch, um, and this was how we as curators chose to resolve the situation. So yeah, so basically, this is this is the end. This is kind of like um, how we chose to interpret and insert understandings of care and community from our own cultures into the exhibition. So, yeah, I can leave it there, Byung.
and
Mm.
that started. And can I invite the first student to ask the first question? 第一个问题是谁 Does anyone get the question one? No? No question one. How about question two? Okay. Rose, can you come to say hi to Lisa? 你看镜头。好。
Hello, I'm
Hi.
and I'm from the Department of Finance. And I'm going to ask you a question. So, you as a long-term practitioner of Doji, how would you interpret Sami practices of aesthetics and storytelling from your curatorial intentions?
Hmm. Well, um, okay. So I think that Doji is one of the practices that we do have in Sami communities that best um, demonstrates this notion of collectivity and care. So in Sami, when I was I was very lucky in that I was taught Doji by my mother and my aunts and my grandparents. So one of the things that they very early on stressed on me is we have this saying in Sami that "Nas moittala mogalkat barakat." So the material tells you how to work. Now, what that means is that if you're working with wood, um, the shape of the wood will tell you how the shape of the object will end up, right? Because you're working together with material and not against them. So I think that a good friend of mine once said that if you force the material, you kill the spirit of that material. And I think the same holds true in curatorial practice, that you should never force your own will upon the artwork and the exhibition, but um, that you work together with the art, together with the artist to create an exhibition. And that is the only way that you can ensure that the spirit of the exhibition, of the art, and of the artist is safe and healthy. So I think that's how my practice as a doyer with Sami storytelling and Sami aesthetics goes into my practice as my curatorial practice. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Yes. And what is about next question?
Thank you for the question. It was a very nice question.
Thank you.
And she's Rose in front finance department. And
Mhm.
what about question three? Please come forward and to say hi to Lisa, and you can sit down and
Hello, I'm Judy, and I'm from Department of Foreign Literature and Language.
Mhm.
So, may I invite you to share about your experience while studying your PhD in museology? Combine your practice with an indigenous research focus that looks into Doji as a Sami system of knowledge.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. So the first thing, very difficult. It was very difficult because in Norway, people don't think that the Sami people, like Norwegians, don't think that the Sami people are clever or smart, or that they have um, systems of knowledge in their culture. So to try and argue that, well, we do have this, and this is what I want to present in my work, was very, very difficult. So I didn't really have um, I mean, I was very lucky in that I had a supervisor who was very supportive, even if, but she was not Norwegian. She was she was Italian actually. Um, so I think it was very difficult, and also because I think that as a PhD student, and this goes for every PhD student, you put very you put enormous amounts of pressure on yourself. You think you need to know from the first day that this is what I will do, this is my research, this is how it will work. And then you the first time you face a disagreement or a struggle, you think to yourself that I'm not good enough. Oh, I'm not good enough. Why does everyone else manage to do this perfectly, and why can't I do the same? And I think it's really important that students understand that no one is perfect. Um, that we all, even your professors, sometimes they struggle with the research. That is part of the research process. It is to realize that you have to change your line of inquiry, or you have to change your method because it's not working the way you thought it was supposed to work. But I don't think that professors and those that are in very high levels in educational institutions I don't think that we are good enough at saying to our students that I struggle too, right? That I have problems, I'm not perfect. And so because I didn't have teachers that knew the subjects that was working in, I had to do it on my own, which was very difficult. And so I didn't have anyone that could say to me that, listen, it's okay. You can, you're not stupid, you're not wrong. You just need to find another way. So that was very difficult, I think. Um, I'm not sure if that is the answer you wanted, but it is the answer that I am going to give, because I really want my students, and students in general, to understand that you are good enough. The work that you're doing is good enough, even when you think it's not. At the end of when you cross that first hurdle, it becomes easier, and eventually, you know, you will deliver. It might not be what you thought initially that you would produce, but you will produce something. So yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the powerful encouragement, powerful word of encouragement for my student. And this 1, 2, 3, the question 4. I think this is just like the supervision. I think this is time for my student have the chance to have to interact with you.
Mm,
Hi, Lisa.
hi.
I'm Dora. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
And may I ask you a question? How would you describe the devastating effect of the colonial discourse on the
Mm.
practice of Doji?
So so actually, Doji is it is a gendered practice. So men have one particular practice and women have another practice. And so within the women's practice, Sami women before colonization had very powerful positions in society. So the leaders of the communities and the lawmakers of the communities were women. And one of the ways that they asserted these roles, one of the ways that they performed these roles and tasks was through the practice of doji. So, for instance, when I showed you about the language, the Chalichimia, Sami women were writing down the histories. They were keeping track of who belonged to which clan. They were deciding who could live within the clan based territories. And then with colonization, what happened was that slowly the understanding of what Doji was changed. And this was done. So the colonial translation of Doji is craft. And this was done to make the practice seem to be simply handcraft. And by doing that, you could also, like the colonial governments, could also say that um, women doesn't have any position in society. Women should be quiet, and you know, the role of women, according to the colonial governments, was to bear children, to keep the house for the men, and that was everything a woman needed to do. So when the colonial governments renamed Doji from a practice that was an epistemology, a system of knowledge, into simple craft, they also renamed the position of women in society, right? So when I talk about the devastating consequences or the devastating effect of the colonial discourse on the practice of Doji, this is some of the things that we see happening. So the subjugation of women in society is what came from the colonial discourse on the practice of Doji. One of the things. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. And the question five, no question five. I will help. This is the indigenous student
Mhm.
from the indigenous program. And can we see it? Hi.
Hi.
先自我介绍，菜
Oh, hi. I'm Lobao. That's my
indigenous name.
yeah.
Lobao indigenous
No
name.
problem.
And she's the fresh. This is first year student, and it's quite sometimes it's quite competitive. Challenges to take the EMI course, but I think she get a lot of efforts to get involved the course. 要老师帮你念吗？还是你先自己？
我自己我自己。
啊进来吗？I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Can we continue?
Yes.
My question is, how Sami communities today work to remember
Practice
practice when
within
do
Duji within Duji
and in the process
negotiate
negotiate Sami
Identity.
identities.
Okay. First, Byung, when you say Doji, you sound Sami. I'm just saying.
yeah, really.
Very good pronunciation. So how do we? Okay. So one of the important strategies in colonization is to take the material culture away from the people. And this is because very often the literature of the people is not found in books. it's found in the objects, it's found in the practices. So when you take away the objects, what you're essentially taking away are the libraries and the archives of knowledge within the community. So Sami communities today, because we have forgotten so much of our knowledge, we need to go into museums and look at the objects that were collected, centuries ago, to remember those knowledges. And the way that we do that is that people like myself, people that are practitioners of Doji, go into museums and we draw the objects, we take pictures of the objects, we spend time with the objects, and then we recreate the objects and we bring that knowledge back to our communities, showing them that in the past, this was how we made these objects, right? So that's how we remember practices in our community, by going into these colonial institutions, and sort of bringing the objects back home with us through our practices and our aesthetics. Mm,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
And number 7, number 6, number 7. 你是第6个问题吗 ？Okay, number 6. Can you sit down and closer? And say hi to Lisa.
Okay.
Hi.
Can I ask you some question?
Mm.
Okay. How museum with Sami communities' vast collection of Sami heritage objects play into this process?
Mm. Okay. Well, because museums have a lot more of our objects than we ourselves have. So, so in that way, museums often become that's where we need to go to find the libraries and archives. We can't go next door to the library. We need to go into the museums and into the collections that they have of our objects. So that's and that of course brings on, are museums willing to give you that access? Oh, I think I'm losing you again. Hi. Hi. Mm, yep, that's fine. Thank you.
Is have a bad connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Did you get my answer before we were cut off?
Yes.
Yes, I think the
Yeah.
museum. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Next
Thank
question.
you.
Okay. Lisa, I think this is a good opportunity for them to asking the question in front
Yeah.
of you. I think this is a good opportunity for them to do the practicing. Yeah.
Yep.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, hello, Lisa. I'm David. I'm from civil engineering department.
Hmm?
And I have a question for you. You are currently based in Pampa on the
Finish
Finnish side of Sámi, where you are doing doctoral
postdoctoral.
postdoctoral research in connection with mediated Arctic geographies. Would you please share about this project for us?
Yeah. So the project the project essentially looks at how the area that we know as the Arctic has been presented in art and books and films and literature. And so my role in the project is actually to look at how the Arctic, from an indigenous perspective, is portrayed in indigenous art and indigenous aesthetic practices. So I look at how the artists' connections to land form their art, basically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Just sit down.
Hi, good morning.
Hi. Good morning.
I'm CJ and I'm currently studying in Human Resource Department. Yeah. So questions is we know the Baru is the topic of your indigenous academic collective. So
Mm.
what's the meaning of Baru?
Okay, so barro means wave, so the ocean wave, an ocean wave, and barro is a collective that I started with 3 other indigenous academic researchers. 2 of them are Sami, and the third one is Inuit from the United States. And we were just sitting and having a conversation together, and all of us complained about universities and institutions that we were so tired of working in non-indigenous context because non-indigenous universities and institutions doesn't really have a lot of room for us to be indigenous. So I suggested that, you know what, we should start an academic collective and see if we can work together to do things outside of the university. And so everyone agreed, and we are actually right now collaborating with several universities to create courses on indigenous methodology and indigenous art and curatorial practices. So, yeah, so essentially, we just wanted to do what we love, and we wanted to do it in our own way. So that was Barro, the collective. Mm.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the borrowed is the word from Sami languages.
Yeah, Barro means wave in a
Wave,
Sami.
ocean wave. Thank
Ocean
you.
wave. Yeah.
What about next question? We don't have number 9, number 10.
Hello, Lisa. My name is
Hello.
Daya from Department of Southeast Asia Studies. May I ask you a question? What is Norwegian crabs? Are there any pitfalls of being as a Sami curator to curate and
Mm,
host indigenous uh, contemporary art exhibition.
hmm. Um, so I think it very much depends on which institution you are collaborating with. So when I curated the Sami Pavilion, I collaborated with um, Office for Contemporary Art Norway, and that was very difficult because they had their own ideas of how they wanted the exhibition to be. So Norwegian Craft, actually, which is the institution in the question, um, I've collaborated with several times. And what Norwegian Craft does is that you have a meeting with them, you talk of your idea, and then Norwegian Craft gives you the money, and then they say, okay, you do what you want to do. So I think the pitfall of working with Indigenous contemporary art exhibition is who pays your salary, right? If they give you free space and room to do what you want to do, great. But that's that doesn't happen often. Most of the time, you know, they have their own agendas, they have their own wants, and then they say to you what they want you to do. And then they expect you to do that. So yeah,
Thank you for all your assistance. Thank you, Lisa.
thank you.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Last one. The last two questions.
Hi.
Can you introduce
Hi.
yourself?
Hi, my name is Lily, and I'm major in the counseling psychology department.
Mhm.
Nice to meet you.
Hi. You too.
I have a question is that would you please share about the reflections with the working with the Sami pavilion,
The conflict or feedback? Something
the,
like
the conflicts or the feedbacks?
Mm. Ah, well, Byung knows a lot about this because Byung, when I was working in Venice, every day I would come home and I would complain, and Byung would cook me dinner and, pat me on the head and say, "It's okay, it's okay." um, so, actually, one of the problems I think with transforming the Nordic Pavilion into the Sami Pavilion was that we didn't we didn't have control over that process. We thought when I was asked to do that, I was told that we would have full control, and then during the process, we learned that um, when as long as we did what the institution wanted, then there was no problems. When we said that we want to do something that the institution disagreed with, then it was a problem because then the institution would say, well, you know, we we have final say, so we decide that this so we had to do things that we didn't really want to do to make the exhibition come together. Now it was a beautiful exhibition. I'm very proud of the work that we did, but I was also very tired after because of trying to do things that was right for your community uh, when despite someone saying that, well, I don't really care about the community, I care about the international art scene, so we're gonna we're gonna work with them in mind instead of the communities. So that was very difficult. But
And what is
yeah.
yeah, and what is your beautiful memory when you walk in as a Sami curators for the Sami Pavilion? That would be, that would be your in your mind. Your thought is really your memory.
Well, my most beautiful memory, Byung, is actually just being together with all of the other indigenous people. Um, so, so in the apartment where I lived, we were, you know, it was a very big apartment, many, many bedrooms. And so we were a big group of indigenous people living together. Byung cooked dinner every day for us. And then just in general, there were so many indigenous people in Venice during the opening of the pavilion. So that was a really beautiful memory. You know, as an indigenous person, and of course, I live in a city. I don't live in my home, like in my home community. For I live where I work. And so that means that I don't often get to see a large group of indigenous people around me. But in Venice, we were almost 200 indigenous people, 300. And we would be, we would go together in big groups. We would go out to have dinner. We would go on walks. And that is so many beautiful memories, just being together with everyone. Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a final question.
Mm.
Then we can finish our conversation. Yeah. And she's also indigenous student. Yeah.
Nice.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Galiskasa, is my indigenous people's name, and Department of Southeast Asia. And I want to ask one question: is how would you describe a Sami-led think tank that gathers thinkers, performers, and artists to dialogue and reflect?
Mm.
And what is your activism on it?
Well,
Thank you.
thank you for such a wonderful question. So I think that indigenous peoples very often come from cultures that are focused on the idea of the collective. So being together and being multiple people making decisions, right? So I think that a Sami-led think tank would, um, what is the activism in that is to essentially just do as your people traditionally have done for generations, right? The activism is to, so I like to think of, in everyday life, every choice I make um, is a choice that I make for the future of my people. So if I want my people to have a future, I need to work for that future to happen. And the way that I do that is by always living as an indigenous person. And so I think just the activism in a Sami-led think tank would actually be just to bring Sami people together, to think together, to talk with one another, to be together and have discussions, because that is what our ancestors have done for as long as anyone can remember. And that is what I hope to see our future people continue to do, just come together and think together and talk together. So I think activism is really, when you think about it, activism is really just living your life as an indigenous being, as an indigenous person. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm so honored to invite you to have the talk and conversation. We have final question. I'm sorry, the final question for this boy. I forgot that. Jave, okay.
Yes. Hello, Lisa. I'm
Hi.
Jave. I'm from Department of Finance.
And I want to ask you a question. May I invite you to share about your first book? It speaks to you, making king through people, stories, and Duji in Sami Museum. What are the potential issues for non-indigenous people to focus on?
I think what I really want non-indigenous people to focus on in my book is the value of Sami knowledges and the value of Sami practices, and how those knowledges and practices is also research. So I would hope that non-indigenous people reading my book understand that just because we are doing research in a way that they might not recognize does not mean that the research we are doing isn't equally valid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
哎，同学，我们这边过来，我们拍个照好。We'll take photos, and Lisa, thank you for your time. And you can check. We take photo together, and I will talk to you. I'll send a message to you later. Yes.
Send me a message later, and I'll talk to you.
Yeah, and we take photo together with my student, and you leave the screen. 要荧幕截图吗？啊，你们要不要过来一点？荧幕截图这样过来这边，过来这边。Dora 还是我们要这样拍 ？OK， 那我们转过来好了。好，过来，我们转过来。Say 1, 2。Dora， 等一下我们换人，换上去。啊，进来一点，进来一点。
其实可以全部这样子先站着，然后面向老师你的镜头，我再用这里截图就好。
可以吗？
然后等一下如果要拍更清楚的话，先请Dora来帮我们拍更清楚，然后等下先挡住那个 left part 因为后面嘛。
OK， 好。Lisa will take photos together. 可以吗？好。是这样。
小心。
好。Lisa, can you see the screen and we take photo?
他老师他只看得到你的背影。
真的吗？OK， cool. OK， 有没有换人？
然后看这边。
都。
还是用那里的方法。
好。
对，大家现在转，然后看这边就。
One more and one more. 哎，进来干嘛 ？Thank you, Lisa. OK.
Thank you. Bye.
Wait a minute.
Bye. Talk to you later, Byung.
没有关系，没有关系，直接拍就好。
Okay. Bye.
快点，大家走了。
等一下，他走吗？
对。
Okay. Bye. So I can just leave now, right?
好，来3、
1、3，可以吗？
没有，老师你再摆一次，你刚刚手放。
OK， 好，再来一次。
对。好，不要动了。OK， 好了。
Okay, Lisa, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Talk to you later, okay?
Yeah, talk to you.
We'll call.
Yeah. We'll call.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Love you. Okay.